So today we're going to have a bit of a heart to heart because I have been furiously writing down some ideas that have come to mind on the past 36 years and my relationship with clutter. Now, while I'm telling you these three things that I have taken away from big core memories I remember about clutter in my life, I want you to remember that we are all coming from our own stories. That's what builds us and makes us who we are. So, therefore, I hope you walk away with some maybe new insight for yourself and reflecting on your life, but hopefully at least a little insight into where I'm coming from. One of the things that I remember throughout my childhood is that clutter can either bring us together or it can divide us. And through the years of living with my parents, I have seen the symmetry and the balance that they build in each other when it comes to clutter. My mom will tell you, even to this day, that she's the kind of person that she likes her things about her. It reminds me always of the movie The Quiet Man, and it's one of my favorite old movies.
300 years of happy dreaming in those things of mine, and I'll have it, and I know it. I'll say no other word to you.
All right, you'll have your dowry or whatever you call it.
And my dad is so much the opposite. He really could probably live a very, very minimal life and often will remind my mom to get rid of things when he sees that the home is becoming too overwhelming. That, yes, though they have completely different thresholds for clutter and could easily live in two separate houses and they would look completely different, they've learned to balance each other. But a lot of times I've seen and experienced that that's not the truth, that often there's one person who refuses to let go. And so therefore it is pushing out other people. If you have ever watched Hoarders, it used to be one of my favorite shows to watch. And a lot of times it was because it made me feel better. Like at least my home doesn't look like that. I know that's awful, but it did make me feel better at the time when I was really overwhelmed with clutter. But I remember looking at their relationships, and there was often a lot of pain and strained. If they weren't divorced, they were on the cusp of getting a divorce. And even though a lot of times the spouse that left would end up coming back and actually helping the person try to declutter, there was a lot of love still there. The hoard was creating so much of a barrier that the other person felt like they couldn't come in. And that's where we can really see that clutter does divide us. That if we're having to spend more time cleaning up our homes, putting things away, or going out shopping, then you really are making a choice to divide that relationship as opposed to building it back up. Another thing that I remember learning from a very young age was that we can easily become desensitized to our clutter and we don't realize that we're choosing it over other people. When I was about 7 years old, my mom, my sister, and I all moved into my grandparents' house because my dad had moved so that he could finish his school, but my mom was still working at a school and wanted us to be able to finish out the year. It was one of the best memories I can remember as a child, though. I know my mom will talk about it differently. It was hard to move back in with her parents, but as the grandchild, I could not have had more fun. And I do remember that was one of the first times that I noticed that there was such a difference between my grandma and my grandfather. And it really all came down to their threshold of clutter, where my grandma was very much a housekeeper. Everything was always in its place. And the main floor where all of us lived was always pristine. My grandfather kept everything and kept everything to the point where it was things that even as a child, I could obviously see didn't really belong and weren't necessary. And yet they were just there. And, of course, as a 7 year old, I wasn't thinking too much about that. It was just a child's observation of how they live so differently. But years later, I think I was an early teenager, maybe 13 or 14. My grandfather's bedroom, which we often would go up there and try and play in, and you'd basically just slip across the floor with all the paper scattered everywhere. We went up there And my mom and my grandma had made a plan that all of us women were going to go up there and we were going to sort and organize everything so that you could clearly see the floor again. And so my grandma, after years of not being able to really clean, could go up there and give it a good clean. And my mom and I worked really hard on this, and it took us hours. And when he finally came home from work, I don't know what I really expected. I was young. I think my mom kind of knew it wasn't going to go over too well, but I think she had high hopes. And I really just thought he would see how hard we worked and be so excited that he had this wonderful open space. That didn't happen. And unfortunately, my mom and my grandma got the brunt of the anger, but it's not all bad. So, because, in our memories, I think a lot of times we put on these, what do they call them? Rose colored glasses. A lot of that yelling is covered up by what ended up happening. So that evening, he came to my mom and I, and we're sitting in this room that we, sorted and decluttered a lot of the trash that was just sitting around. And he thanked us, and he actually apologized, said he was sorry for yelling at us. And that's what I take away from this. Years after that, was able to keep it a lot more clean, and my grandma never allowed it to really go back to the way it was. She always was able to clean up and keep it a certain kind of livable up in his room in the attic. And that really showed me that, yes, we do in a lot of ways become desensitized to our clutter. And we don't see that that is affecting the other people around us. Even if we say, oh, it's only in my room, oh, it's only in the shed, it does affect the other people living in the home in a way that we were worried about my grandfather as he was getting pretty old, slipping and hurting himself. We were very overwhelmed by all of the things that he had there. And so, though it wasn't our things to declutter and get rid of, and I don't necessarily condone the way we did it, we did know in the moment that if we had asked, like we had done before, it never would have happened. It did teach me a lesson as a young person that we need to be aware of the other people that are around us, and don't think that just because we keep it stored away, that that is not hurting them as well, or that's not affecting them because it's my stuff. We do need to challenge and ask and have those conversations to make sure that we are not dividing our relationships, that we are making them stronger because we understand where the other person is coming from. If we're spending a lot of our time and energy on accumulating and keeping up with all of our things, we may not, and we probably don't, see how that is taking away time from the relationships that we really do value. But we're not seeing that because we're only looking through our own lens. And I think a lot of us have stories like that where, what are the biggest things that impact relationships are money and clutter and, how we speak to each other, our emotional connections with each other. And as a child, it really was a very pivotal moment for me to learn that people are more important than our things. And sometimes we have to remind those around us or even ourselves that is really the truth. Let's move on now down my timeline, and we're gonna stop in my early 30s when my decluttering adult journey really began. And it taught me that change is scary and change is uncomfortable, but you don't really know who you are or who you could be unless you're willing to face the scary. We are afraid of change and things that are different because we have to build new neuro connections in our brain. The neuroplasticity, I think is the word, it gets affected when we have to change. Think about the last time you had to move or you had to change your job. Even if you wanted to do those things, it was probably anxiety inducing and overwhelming at times. And especially if you didn't want to do them, it really was probably like a tornado storm in your brain because you had to change and things had to be different. In that discomfort, a lot of times we not only grow and learn more about ourselves, but we get more flexibility in our thinking. And so let's go and start with when I first decided that something had to change in my home. I was sitting on the couch and I was watching a Netflix show from the Minimalist. It was one of their documentaries. And I'd never heard about minimalism before. It was a brand new concept, but I'm one of those people that I love to learn about new things. So I just thought this was like an out there idea. And as I'm watching it, I was listening to Joshua Mills Philburn. Nope, that's not his name. We're going to call him Joshua. Fields Milburn. There we go. I was listening to his story, and I, though, hadn't experienced the trauma in his life, I still related enough to a lot of things he said. So he talked about in 1 month, he had lost his mom and he had gotten divorced. And he was getting ready to, pack up all of his mom's stuff and take it over to his overstuffed house already. And he just changed. He decided that not only was he going to get rid of most of the things that was his mother's house, he was going to get rid of most of his own things. He was ready for a radical change, and he knew something had to be different because not only had his life get turned upside down, he wasn't happy anymore. And I think he later turned and he quit his job, and things just really changed through minimalism. And in listening to that story, I was sitting there and I was thinking about how I had been drowning for a long time, like he was. And I was ready for something different. I just didn't know what it was. At the time, at a job where my immediate coworkers were making my every single day a living misery. And I had a very young toddler who was amazing, but it was, new experiences all the time. And I was constantly exhausted. And not only that, but I was also constantly overwhelmed by my home and feeling like I wasn't good enough. I wasn't being able to keep up and keep it clean and safe for my daughter. And I was constantly in this spiral of buying more things because I thought that's what she needed, that she needed more toys and clothes to be happy. And when I finally watched this documentary, it's like I woke up for the first time and I realized that there is something different out there. And while I was so excited for this new idea, I had no clue on how I was actually going to make that happen because I was not a single man living in my home by myself. I was a mom with a child and a husband, and I was talking about some radical change here that I couldn't force somebody else to do. And so through that experience, I really learned that I had to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations with my husband, and I had to get comfortable in failing and failing a lot. As a teacher, I know knowledge is power, and I knew that the more I learned about this subject, the better I could get at it, the more comfortable I could be. But it didn't make the decluttering and it didn't make the compulsive shopping just make sense. And I still compulsive shopped a lot. I have ADHD, and through this last year, I finally got diagnosed with ADHD. So that really helped me have a better understanding of why I was so compulsive with some of the things I was doing, like shopping. But even before that, it was my dedication to being uncomfortable that finally got me to a place where I am today. So, that being said, something that makes us stop a lot on our decluttering journey, on learning about organization, is that it's hard to be uncomfortable. Our brain doesn't like it. Our brain doesn't like something new. It would much prefer to stick to the same old same and the comfort and not changing. But if I hadn't changed, and if I had just said this was too hard, or if I'd given up the first time that I had failed and bought a bunch of things all over again, I would still be in that same tornado of overwhelm that I was for all those years. And so there is a lot to be said about living in discomfort. I remember I was listening to a podcast about learning new language, and they had a conference of people that learned like 7 or 8 different languages. And there was the researcher had found that there was a connection that made all of these people the same. And the connection came down to the fact that they were okay with being uncomfortable, that they could withstand the awful feeling that you get when you're in a conversation with somebody and you're learning a new language and you don't know the word you want to say. But they created a habit of putting themselves in those uncomfortable situations so that they got more and more used to the fact that you're going to make mistakes. And that's how they really learn to grow and have all of these different languages, because their brain learned that being uncomfortable was a good thing, that failing was something that everybody does over and over again, and you're going to learn from your failure. With that being said, when it comes to decluttering, we are all different. When it comes to organization, we all need different things. And though I can only share from my own experiences of life and things that have worked for me, these 3 things that I just shared with you, I think are overall truths for a lot of us. And I'm sure you have learned a ton from your own life, and I would love to hear about that too. But just remember that our clutter can either connect us or separate us. A lot of times we don't even see our clutter, and so therefore we don't see how that affects other people. And that change is scary but necessary and will make you uncomfortable, but will make you the best version of yourself. All right, friends. If you learned a little bit about minimalism, I would love for you to join us here on Minimalist by subscribing. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more, then click on one of these videos right here. And I wish you guys all the very best.